The story begins not with action, but with anticipation, the heavy, invisible pressure that follows violence long after the last shot has faded. The man moves through a landscape altered by war, every step guided by what he believes is inevitable. He has learned, as all soldiers and captives do, that encounters between enemies rarely end quietly. History, rumor, and experience have trained him to expect fury when power changes hands. He braces himself for it, rehearsing the moment in his mind as if preparation might dull the blow. Anger, he assumes, will come first, shouted accusations, the unleashing of long-suppressed hatred. Revenge will follow, precise and personal, justified by loss on the other side. This is how war balances itself, or so he has been taught. His body reflects this certainty. Muscles tighten instinctively, breath shortens, and his posture carries the unconscious defensiveness of someone who expects to be struck. Even his thoughts feel armored, arranged to absorb humiliation and pain. He does not hope for mercy. Hope has long been burned out of him by necessity. Survival has depended on expecting the worst and enduring it. In this moment, fear is not chaotic but disciplined, shaped into readiness. He believes he understands what is coming, and that belief offers a grim kind of stability. The setting reinforces his expectations. The physical world bears the marks of conflict. Structures damaged or repurposed, landscapes stripped of neutrality and turned into instruments of strategy. Everything around him has been bent toward confrontation. In such a place, calm feels unnatural, almost dishonest. The man reads the environment the way soldiers are trained to do, scanning for cues of danger, dominance, and intent. He expects noise, movement, an unmistakable signal that the reckoning has begun. Instead, what greets him is quiet. It is not the quiet of abandonment or exhaustion, but something more deliberate. The absence of raised voices feels intentional, as though emotion itself has been withheld. The British presence is unmistakable, yet restrained. Authority exists here without spectacle. No one rushes forward, no one gestures dramatically. There is no visible eagerness to settle scores. The lack of aggression does not ease him, it confuses him. His mind struggles to categorize what he is seeing because it does not match the internal map he has relied on for years. The calm unsettles him precisely because it denies him the role he has prepared to play. He has accepted, even internalized, the identity of the defeated enemy who must endure punishment. Without that punishment arriving on schedule, he feels exposed in a different way. His fear has nowhere to land. The emotional impact of the moment begins to shift from anticipation of pain to a deeper unease, one rooted in uncertainty. War has conditioned him to believe that silence precedes violence, but this silence does not feel like a pause before an explosion. It feels sustained, controlled, almost indifferent to his presence. As seconds pass, the stillness grows heavier. He becomes acutely aware of his own breathing, of the way his thoughts keep circling back to anger that never arrives. The absence of hostility forces his attention inward. He realizes how much of his identity in this moment depends on the reaction of others. He is waiting to be defined by their response, to be confirmed as an enemy worthy of hatred. Without that confirmation, he feels strangely unanchored. The British soldiers do not perform victory. There is no visible satisfaction in the reversal of power, no emotional release. Their composure suggests a different relationship to the moment, one not governed by impulse or revenge, but by order and procedure. This, too, is a kind of power, though one the man is unaccustomed to recognizing. It does not shout its dominance, it assumes it. The calm operates like a barrier, cool and impenetrable, denying him access to the emotional exchange he expects. This restraint creates a tension more profound than open aggression. Violence would have been familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Calm, by contrast, strips the situation of its narrative clarity. The man cannot tell whether he is being spared, judged, or simply processed as part of a larger mechanism that does not require his suffering to function. The thought unsettles him. It suggests that the war may not revolve around individual hatred after all, that his personal fear and readiness for pain might be irrelevant. In this suspended moment, time seems to stretch. The man becomes aware of the long chain of events that has led him here. Decisions made under pressure, loyalties shaped by circumstance, actions justified by survival rather than belief. He has told himself many stories to endure the war, chief among them the idea that enemies are driven by the same emotions he feels. Hatred, anger, vengeance. These have been the emotional currencies of conflict, traded freely on all sides. Now, confronted with calm, he begins to sense how fragile those assumptions are. The quiet is not empty, it is dense with implication. It forces him to confront the possibility that the enemy he has imagined may not exist in the form he expected. This realization does not bring relief. Instead, it introduces a different kind of fear, the fear of being seen not as a monster to be punished, but as a human being whose suffering does not require spectacle. In that framing, his losses and sacrifices lose their moral insulation. They are no longer shielded by reciprocal cruelty. He notices details he would have ignored in a moment of chaos: the measured movements, the lack of unnecessary force, the way commands are given without theatricality. These details accumulate into an impression that is difficult to reconcile with his expectations. The British calm does not signal forgiveness or kindness in any sentimental sense. It signals control, a refusal to let emotion dictate outcome. That refusal feels, to him, like a form of disarmament. The psychological preparation he has relied on begins to unravel. Anger, when anticipated, can be endured. Humiliation can be absorbed if it follows a known pattern. But this calm offers no pattern to brace against. It asks nothing of him, demands no reaction, and in doing so removes the structure he has built to survive the moment. He finds himself exposed not to violence, but to ambiguity. As the encounter continues, the man understands that something irreversible is taking place, not externally, but within him. The war has taught him to see moral worth in endurance under cruelty. Now, confronted with restraint, he feels that framework slipping. The absence of revenge denies him the chance to confirm his own narrative of suffering. It leaves him alone with the question of what the war has made him, and whether that transformation was ever truly necessary. This first chapter closes not with resolution, but with suspension. The expected explosion never comes. Instead, the calm settles like frost, freezing both expectation and response. The man stands at the threshold of a realization he does not yet fully grasp, that the most destabilizing force in war is not always violence, but the refusal to perpetuate it. In this moment of quiet, the foundations of his understanding begin to crack, setting the stage for a moral reversal that will unfold not through action, but through restraint. The calm does not break. Instead, it settles into the space like an unspoken rule, shaping every movement and decision that follows. The man waits for escalation, convinced that restraint is temporary, a prelude to something harsher. In war, discipline often masks cruelty until the moment it is unleashed. Yet the longer the silence stretches, the clearer it becomes that this is not a delay. It is the response itself. Authority makes itself known without raising its voice. Orders are delivered with precision, stripped of emotion, as if the situation were routine rather than charged with years of bloodshed. The man watches closely, searching for cracks in this composure, any sign that anger simmers beneath the surface. He expects faces hardened by loss, eyes narrowed by hatred. What he sees instead is detachment, not coldness, but something closer to professional distance. The British soldiers act as though the moral outcome of the encounter has already been decided, and that decision does not require spectacle. This restraint unsettles him more deeply than punishment would have. He has prepared himself to endure rage, to absorb blows both physical and verbal, because suffering would confirm the logic of everything that came before. Revenge would have validated the sacrifices demanded by war, proving that hatred flows naturally from loss. But here, hatred seems absent, or at least irrelevant. The man begins to sense that he is not standing before avengers, but before a system that does not need to hate him in order to control him. The realization is profoundly disorienting. War has taught him that emotion is currency, that rage fuels action and gives meaning to endurance. Without it, the entire framework begins to wobble. He feels as though he has arrived prepared for a storm only to find clear skies, and the mismatch leaves him exposed. His fear has no target. His anger, long held in check, has nowhere to go. As minutes pass, his awareness sharpens. He notices how the soldiers avoid unnecessary gestures, how weapons remain present but undramatic, how commands are followed without flourish. This is not mercy offered as a gift, nor forgiveness extended as a moral statement. It is restraint practiced as discipline. The difference matters. Mercy would imply a personal judgment in his favor. This calm implies something colder and more unsettling, that his suffering does not factor into their sense of justice at all. The man feels a subtle shift inside himself. His body, once braced for impact, begins to register the strain of holding tension without release. The adrenaline that prepared him for violence has nowhere to dissipate. Instead, it turns inward, amplifying every thought. He becomes acutely conscious of his own expectations, of how thoroughly he has been shaped by the belief that enemies must mirror one another's cruelty. Facing an opponent who refuses to perform hatred forces him to confront how deeply he relied on that symmetry. Memory intrudes, uninvited. He recalls moments when he himself acted with restraint, moments he dismissed as weakness or necessity rather than choice. He thinks of orders followed without question, actions justified by the language of duty. Watching the British soldiers now, he recognizes the same mechanisms at work, but directed toward control rather than revenge. The parallel disturbs him. It suggests that cruelty was never inevitable, that violence may have been as much a decision as restraint now appears to be. The calm continues to exert pressure, quiet but relentless. It strips away the emotional clarity that war thrives on. Without an enemy performing hatred, the man finds it harder to justify his own. The narratives he has carried, of righteous suffering, of unavoidable brutality, begin to fray at the edges. He does not abandon them entirely, but he feels their grip weaken. In their place emerges a more troubling awareness, that the war's moral logic may have depended on mutual participation, on both sides agreeing to play their roles. He studies the faces before him, searching for humanity or its absence. What he finds is something more complex. The soldiers are not indifferent to him as a person, but they are indifferent to his need for emotional resolution. They do not offer him the satisfaction of being hated. This refusal feels like a denial of his final defense. If he is not despised, then what justification remains for the choices he made, for the harm inflicted and endured? Time behaves strangely in this moment. Without action to mark its passage, it feels suspended, heavy. The man senses that this encounter will linger far beyond its duration, not because of what is done to him, but because of what is withheld. The absence of revenge becomes a presence in its own right, shaping the psychological landscape of the moment. He realizes that he is being disarmed not physically, but morally. The British calm begins to feel less like neutrality and more like a statement, though one never articulated aloud. It communicates confidence without cruelty, authority without rage. This composure suggests that power does not require emotional validation, that dominance need not announce itself through suffering. For the man, raised in the brutal economy of war, this is perhaps the most destabilizing lesson of all. He becomes aware of a subtle freeze settling over the encounter. Not paralysis born of fear, but a mutual stillness, as if both sides sense the gravity of what is unfolding. The soldiers maintain their discipline, the man maintains his silence. In this shared restraint, the usual dynamics of victor and vanquished blur. The encounter does not escalate, but it also does not resolve. It hovers, suspended between what was expected and what is occurring. Inside, the man feels the slow erosion of certainty. He no longer knows how to interpret his own survival in this moment. Is it grace? Indifference? Strategy? Each possibility carries implications he is not ready to face. Grace would demand gratitude. Indifference would render his suffering meaningless. Strategy would suggest that restraint is simply another weapon, more efficient than revenge. He realizes that calm, in this context, is not passive. It is active, chosen, enforced. It requires discipline to maintain, especially in the face of an enemy conditioned to expect cruelty. This recognition forces him to reconsider the nature of strength. He has always equated power with the ability to inflict pain. Now he is confronted with a power that refuses to do so, and the refusal itself feels overwhelming. As the chapter closes, the man remains standing in this unresolved space, caught between expectation and reality. The British calm has not absolved him, nor has it punished him. Instead, it has stripped the encounter of emotional spectacle, leaving behind a stark, unsettling quiet. In that quiet, the foundations of his understanding of war begin to shift. He does not yet know what will replace them, only that the old logic, anger met with anger, revenge answered with revenge, has been interrupted. The freeze that settles over the moment is not merely physical or procedural. It is psychological, a pause in the machinery of hatred, and it leaves him profoundly, uncomfortably awake. As the encounter continues, the balance quietly but unmistakably begins to change. The man senses it not through any visible action, but through an internal displacement, as though the emotional ground beneath him has shifted. The fear he arrived with does not vanish, but it loses its sharpness. In its place emerges something more unsettling: awareness. He becomes conscious not only of what is happening, but of how deeply his own expectations have shaped his perception of reality. For the first time since the war began, he is forced to observe himself in the moment rather than simply endure it. The calm surrounding him presses inward. Without shouting, without threat, it leaves him alone with his thoughts. He realizes how much of his psychological survival has depended on clear roles: enemy and ally, victor and victim, punishment and endurance. Those roles offered structure, even when they were cruel. They told him how to feel, how to respond, how to justify what he had done and what had been done to him. Now, stripped of those cues, he feels exposed in a way violence never made him feel. He notices a subtle change in his posture. His shoulders, once rigid, begin to lower almost involuntarily. His body seems confused by the absence of attack, unsure whether to remain armored or to rest. This physical shift unsettles him, because it suggests that his defenses were never entirely under conscious control. They were reactions, conditioned responses to an environment where hostility was assumed. In this moment, the conditioning falters. The British soldiers remain composed, their stillness consistent, their behavior unchanged. This consistency reinforces the sense that the calm is not accidental. It is not kindness sparked by sympathy, nor hesitation born of doubt. It is deliberate. The man begins to grasp that this restraint is not about him personally. It would exist regardless of who stood in his place. That realization cuts deeper than condemnation ever could. He feels the weight of his own expectations pressing back on him. He had prepared to be hated, to absorb anger as confirmation that the war's logic still held. Hatred would have allowed him to remain fixed in his identity as an enemy, defined by opposition. Without it, he feels undefined. The absence of rage does not absolve him. Instead, it removes the familiar framework through which he has understood his own guilt and suffering. Thoughts surface that he has long kept buried. He remembers moments when he acted not out of conviction, but out of momentum. Orders followed because they existed, violence committed because it was expected. At the time, these actions felt inevitable, shaped by forces larger than himself. Now, confronted with restraint chosen under similar pressures, he begins to question that inevitability. The comparison is uncomfortable. It suggests that alternatives may have existed, that the path of cruelty was not the only one available. This line of thought does not bring relief. It brings a quiet, creeping unease. If violence was a choice, even a constrained one, then responsibility becomes harder to deflect. The calm he faces now seems to illuminate this truth without accusation. No one speaks it aloud. No one needs to. The silence does the work. He becomes aware of the passage of time in a new way. Without dramatic action to divide moments, time feels thick, almost viscous. Each second stretches, allowing reflection to deepen rather than dissipate. The war has trained him to live in bursts of intensity, where thought is a liability and reaction is survival. Here, thought is unavoidable. The mind, denied distraction, turns inward. The man's anger, long suppressed, begins to lose its clarity. It does not erupt, it diffuses. He realizes that much of it was sustained by expectation, by the belief that it would be met with equal force. Anger unopposed begins to feel hollow, directionless. Without an external target, it collapses into something closer to grief. Not grief for a single loss, but for the accumulation of years shaped by a logic that now appears incomplete. He studies the soldiers again, this time not as enemies, but as participants in the same machinery of war. Their discipline mirrors his own past discipline, but aimed toward containment rather than release. This mirroring unsettles him. It blurs the line he has relied on to separate himself morally from those who oppose him. The realization dawns slowly, painfully, that the distance between them may not be as vast as he once believed. The calm begins to feel less like a void and more like a mirror. In it, he sees reflected the parts of himself he has avoided examining. His readiness for revenge, his expectation of cruelty, his acceptance of suffering as meaningful, all of it comes into question. The war's emotional economy, built on reciprocal hatred, appears suddenly fragile. He senses that it requires constant reinforcement to sustain itself. Remove one side's participation, and the structure wobbles. A subtle shift occurs in his understanding of power. He has always equated it with force, with the ability to impose one's will through pain. Watching restraint hold steady in the face of expectation, he begins to suspect that power can also reside in refusal. The refusal to escalate, to satisfy the anticipated script of revenge, exerts a pressure of its own. It forces the other party to confront themselves without the distraction of violence. This realization does not make him feel smaller. It makes him feel uncertain. Uncertainty, in war, is dangerous. It undermines resolve, blurs objectives, weakens the emotional armor that allows individuals to endure the unendurable. He senses that this moment, quiet as it is, poses a threat to something fundamental within him. Not his safety, but his understanding. He notices how the soldier's calm does not invite negotiation or appeal. It is not an opening. It is a boundary. Within that boundary, there is no room for the emotional bargaining he has prepared, no space to perform remorse, defiance, or submission in exchange for mercy. The absence of this transactional dynamic leaves him with nothing to offer and nothing to resist. He is simply present. The psychological shift deepens. He begins to feel the strain of years spent suppressing doubt. The calm allows doubt to surface without being immediately crushed by urgency. Questions arise that he has avoided. What did the war require of him, and what did it take? What parts of himself were sacrificed not because they had to be, but because the environment rewarded their absence? These questions do not accuse him. They linger, unanswered, heavy. The British composure remains unchanged, and in that constancy, the man senses something final. Not an ending, but a point of no return. Whatever comes next, he knows that his understanding of the war will not revert to what it was. The calm has interrupted a cycle that defined his emotional life. Even if violence resumes elsewhere, this moment will stand apart, resistant to assimilation into the familiar narrative. As the encounter continues, a kind of stillness settles over both sides. It is not the stillness of fear or paralysis, but of recognition. Something has shifted, even if no one acknowledges it openly. The man feels suspended between his past and an uncertain internal future. He has not been forgiven, nor condemned. He has been confronted with restraint, and that confrontation has left him exposed. By the time this phase of the encounter draws toward its end, the psychological balance has irrevocably altered. The man no longer braces for anger. He no longer waits for revenge. Instead, he stands in a space defined by reflection, unsettled by the realization that the war's deepest battles may not have been fought where he believed. The calm that disarmed him continues to exert its quiet force, reshaping his understanding from within, leaving him aware, perhaps for the first time, of the cost of hatred, and of the strange, disquieting power that emerges when it is denied. The realization continues to settle like dust in the man's mind, forming patterns that were once invisible to him. The world he has known, the one shaped by conflict, has always had its clarity in violence. It was simple in its logic. You either dominate or you are dominated. Power was wielded through force and brutality, through the emotional release of rage. His existence, his role in this war, was shaped by this brutal clarity. He was prepared for destruction, for retribution, and for the redemption that violence would provide to the wronged. Revenge was not only inevitable, it was necessary. Without it, what was left? Without the clarity of punishment and retaliation, there would be only a disturbing kind of vacuum, a moral gray zone that seemed uninhabitable. But now, confronted with the calm that has refused to yield, the man begins to feel this vacuum taking shape. It is not the absence of emotion, it is the absence of what he has come to rely on, the structure that emotional extremes provide. The expectation of anger, the anticipation of revenge, had allowed him to process the war, to navigate the horrors. He had reconciled himself to suffering because it was always matched by a sense of purpose. The pain he endured and inflicted seemed necessary, justified by the cause of the conflict. But now, in the face of restraint, he begins to grasp a terrifying truth, that the moral clarity of revenge is nothing but an illusion, one that crumbles when the cycle of retaliation is broken. The British soldiers, silent and composed, have taught him a new kind of power. Their refusal to engage in the predictable drama of hatred unsettles him, not because he fears them, but because he begins to fear what this kind of control means for his own understanding of the war. He had always believed that without hate, there could be no war. He had defined his own actions by his emotional response to the enemy, but this calm forces him to see that war can exist without hatred. It can exist without the visceral charge of emotional involvement. The soldier's ability to act without the fuel of vengeance makes them something he does not understand. They operate as if the war is not personal, as if it is a task that requires no moral judgment, no need for retaliation, just a simple execution of duty. This realization stirs something deeper in him. It is not just a loss of emotional clarity, it is a loss of purpose. He begins to see the war for what it is, a collection of individuals, each bound by their own complex emotions, each acting according to systems that make little room for personal vendetta. He has been part of that system, trapped by it, believing that he was either the enactor or the recipient of a moral balancing act. What happens when that balance is refused? When the revenge he has prepared for, expected, and even relied upon, is withheld, what happens to the man caught in the middle of that absence? The man's internal world begins to fragment. His role in the war, once so certain, is now in question. He had accepted his position as the enemy, the one to be defeated, the one to be punished. It was not only the enemy soldiers who bore this same burden, it was part of the entire framework of conflict. Each side believed in the necessity of their actions, believing that vengeance justified the means. But here, in this moment of stillness, the man begins to see that this logic may have been false from the beginning. What happens to a soldier when the script they have followed their entire life no longer applies? What happens when there is no retribution to seek, no moral clarity to fall back on? His mind turns inwards, unraveling the threads of his own past actions. He recalls moments where violence seemed inevitable, where the enemy was just another obstacle to overcome, another face to crush beneath the weight of his own righteousness. He had justified so many of his actions under the banner of survival, of duty, of defending his own people, his own cause. In those moments, his anger had felt righteous, almost sacred. But now, confronted with the stark reality of this encounter, he begins to wonder, was it ever righteous? Or was it simply easier to hold on to the belief that revenge was a necessary force, that suffering could be justified as long as it led to something meaningful? The stillness forces him to examine the emotional architecture that has supported him through the war. The belief in the rightness of his cause, the certainty that his enemies were just as bound by hatred as he was, these things are the cornerstones of his identity. They are the lenses through which he has interpreted every battle, every moment of hardship, every act of violence. The idea that vengeance is a universal law, that it is something written into the fabric of the conflict, has always allowed him to believe that he was on the side of justice, even when the consequences were brutal. But now, he feels the ground slipping beneath him. If vengeance is not inevitable, then what is the purpose of this war? What is the purpose of his actions? The longer the calm persists, the more disoriented he becomes. The absence of anger leaves a vacuum in his chest. At first, he feels liberated, unburdened by the weight of expectation, unencumbered by the need to respond in kind to what has been done to him. But this feeling quickly turns to dread. What is left if not anger, if not the drive to strike back against the pain? He begins to see that anger, vengeance, and revenge were not only tools of war, they were the very glue that held his identity together. Without them, he feels fragmented. Without the clarity of right and wrong, enemy and ally, he no longer knows where he stands. He is a man who has been denied his role in a drama that was once so certain, so clear. The soldiers in front of him remain unchanged, their eyes fixed ahead, their movements purposeful but unhurried. They are not distracted by his internal struggle. They are not moved by the emotions that have defined his life for so long. In their restraint, they do not demand retribution. They do not offer forgiveness. They simply exist, performing their duty with a kind of quiet resolve that refuses to acknowledge his suffering. And this, more than anything else, stirs something profound within him. He begins to question the entire concept of duty. For years, he has acted out of a sense of obligation, a belief that his role in the war was to follow orders, to carry out tasks that seemed righteous because they were given to him by the system in which he believed. But now, in the presence of soldiers who carry out their duty without the emotional baggage he has always attached to his own, he begins to understand that duty is not inherently moral. Duty is simply action, repeated without question, often without understanding. It can be the path to peace or to destruction, depending on the hands that wield it. As these realizations sink in, he feels an uncomfortable stillness inside of himself. This is not the passive absence of emotion he once expected. This is an active, internal paralysis. Without the release of anger, he is left alone with his thoughts he has spent years avoiding. What does it mean to be human in the face of such a war? What does it mean to survive when the emotional markers of survival have been stripped away? These questions churn in his mind, a storm of self-reflection that has no outlet. The encounter stretches on, neither concluding nor escalating. The man finds himself no longer waiting for something to happen. Instead, he waits for something to shift inside of him. The calm has taken hold not just of the external world, but of his internal one. The more he resists it, the deeper it seeps into him. It is not the absence of emotion that terrifies him. It is the realization that perhaps emotion was never necessary in the first place, that war, at its core, is not about vengeance. It is about survival, about duty, about forces much larger than any individual. He has spent his life seeking justification in the emotional responses of others, but now he begins to see that perhaps those responses, whether fueled by anger or by mercy, are just distractions from the true nature of the conflict. And in that realization, he is left alone, confronting the deepest question of all. What is the true nature of war, and where does he fit into it? As the moments pass, the stillness begins to feel less like an absence and more like a presence, subtle but persistent, pressing in on the man's thoughts, his emotions, his very understanding of the situation. It is not the oppressive quiet of a place abandoned, nor the oppressive stillness of a battlefield waiting for the next round of destruction. It is the stillness of something restrained, something deliberately held in check, its power not in the absence of action, but in the refusal to perform what the man has always assumed was inevitable. In the absence of rage, he feels not relief, but a profound discomfort. He has spent his life expecting the eruption of violence, of emotion, and this calm acts like a mirror, showing him his own dependency on that eruption to define his existence. The British soldiers, still and composed, continue their duty without hesitation, but without the satisfaction that normally comes with victory. There is no boast, no triumph in their eyes. No anger, no hatred. There is simply purpose. It is an unsettling, disorienting kind of control, one that is not based on the desire to prove superiority, but on the recognition of the situation as it is. an interaction that must be managed, not emotionally charged. The man, once certain that conflict could only unfold in a predictable dance of vengeance and countervengeance, now faces a challenge to the very framework through which he has lived. The absence of aggression is not weakness. The realization strikes him with a jolt. It is not absence at all. It is a power more refined, more controlled, more insistent than the violence he has expected. This recognition hits him harder than any blow could have. He has always believed that to be in power was to command through force, to dominate through emotional extremes, rage, hatred, revenge. His identity as a soldier, as a warrior, has been bound to that idea. His survival has hinged on the assumption that vengeance is not only a natural impulse, but a necessary one. But now, confronted with restraint, he begins to understand that this is a power far more terrifying. It is power that does not need to dominate, power that can exist in silence, power that requires no justification through emotional extremes. The dissonance between what he has known and what he faces grows more pronounced. He begins to understand, slowly, that his concept of strength was rooted in emotional investment, the certainty that his anger and his suffering had meaning because they were reciprocated by his enemies. War, to him, had always been an exchange, suffering for suffering, pain for pain. The soldier who can endure is the one who understands this exchange and accepts it. It is only through this cycle that one can find meaning in destruction. Without it, the whole system falls apart. But now, faced with soldiers who do not participate in this exchange, he is forced to confront something much darker, much deeper, that there may be no meaning at all to what he has endured. The war may have been an endless cycle not of moral clarity, but of emotional manipulation, with both sides participating in the same dance of vengeance, trapped in a logic that offers no way out. The more he reflects, the more he realizes the extent to which he has been shaped by the war, by his need to believe that his suffering was justified, that his actions had meaning because they were part of a larger, understandable framework. He has been taught to believe that victory is the reward for suffering, that vengeance is the price of peace. But the British soldiers, with their composed demeanor and their refusal to engage in the expected emotional release of violence, force him to question the very foundation of this belief. It is not just that they are refusing to retaliate, it is that they are denying the emotional framework that has governed his life for so long. They are refusing to be part of the script he has written in his mind. The shift in his perception is gradual but undeniable. As time passes, he feels the loss of his own moral clarity. In the absence of the predictable ebb and flow of conflict, of anger met with anger, of revenge exchanged for suffering, he begins to question the worth of the war itself. Was it truly about right and wrong? Was it really about fighting for a cause? Or was it merely a continuation of emotional patterns, a cycle of reaction that could never be broken? He finds himself adrift in this new, disorienting space, caught between the world he knows and the reality he is now forced to see. The refusal of the British soldiers to engage in the expected emotional script leaves him with no role to play. He is neither the aggressor nor the victim. He is simply a man standing in the midst of a conflict that no longer makes sense. The anger that has long defined him begins to dissipate, replaced by an unsettling quiet within himself. The emotional fire that once fueled his every action has nowhere to burn. He begins to question not only the soldiers in front of him, but himself. What have I been fighting for? What has been the point of all this? The unsettling nature of the silence around him only deepens as the realization of this dissonance grows. For the first time, the man begins to feel small, not in the way one might feel small before overwhelming power, but in the way one feels small when the rules of the world they have lived by suddenly collapse. He has no words for what he is feeling. It is a sense of vertigo, of dislocation, as though the ground beneath him is no longer stable, and everything he thought he understood about himself, about the war, about his place in the world, is now called into question.